first fireside chat, we've got two awesome guests who are joining us. The very first one, I'm super excited to announce Michael Daniel, who's going to be joining us. Michael served as the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, kind of serves as the president and CEO of Cyber Threat Alliance, a not-for-profit that enabled cyber threat information sharing among cybersecurity companies and organizations. Prior to CTA, Michael served for 4 years as the U.S. cybersecurity coordinator, leading the U.S. cybersecurity policy development, facilitating U.S. government partnerships with private sector and other nations, and coordinating significant incident response activities. From 1995 to 2012, Michael worked for the Office of Management and Budget overseeing funding for the U.S. intelligence community. Michael also works for the Aspen Cybersecurity Group, the World Economic Forum's Partnership Against Cybercrime, and has also been part of the Ransomware Task Force. Please join me in welcoming Michael. Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to have you here.
Yes.
Please have a seat. And joining Michael is going to be TJ Rylander. And I'm super excited to announce TJ. Not only is TJ one of our board members and one of our investors at Armablocks, but TJ joined Next 47 in 2017. He's based out of Palo Alto. And TJ's focus is on sourcing and supporting investments in robotics, enterprise IT, cybersecurity verticals, companies like us at Armablocks. Prior to Next 47, TJ served as a managing partner at IQT or In-Q-Tel. For those of you who don't know this, IQT is a nonprofit strategic venture firm that operates on behalf of the US government and the intelligence community. They invest in startups, and while leading IQT's investments, his investments were focused on cybersecurity, data center technologies, and these included companies like Platfora, which is acquired by Workday, and multi-billion-dollar IPOs of FireEye, Cloudera, and Pure Storage. Outside of Next 47, TJ also serves as a director for the Institute of Security and Technology, a nonprofit dedicated to improving international security through better technology and policy. TJ, welcome. Great to have you here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I'll let you two kick it off. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Michael, it's great to talk with you today.
Yes, absolutely.
The topic that we're going to dive into is public-private partnerships and what it can mean for improved cybersecurity. And I know you've got a great viewpoint and an incredible amount of expertise when it comes to how to optimize these partnerships. But I'd like to start off by sharing a little skepticism. And that is anything that has such nice alliteration, it's got to be a little suspect. So public-private partnerships, what does that mean, and where is the substance there?
Sure. I mean, public-private partnerships it's one of those terms that's become like consultant speak, like synergy. Like you can have it mean a whole bunch of whatever you want it to. But I think what it really recognizes is that in the space of cybersecurity, unlike in a lot of other domains, say counterterrorism or some of those kinds of issues, the private sector plays an outsized role, not only in terms of what they own, right? Most of the infrastructure for the internet is in fact owned by the private sector, but also in the capability that they bring, the information that they have, the viewpoint that they have. And just given the math and physics of cyberspace, you can't really actually separate out those roles in the same clear way you can, say, in border security. And so the result is that we actually have to figure out ways for the government and the private sector to work together and not just coexist.
So can you give us one early example?
Sure. So a lot of what I talk about is operational collaboration, right? So how do you actually line up things that the private sector can do with things that we want the government to do? And how do you actually coordinate that in space and time so that you actually have the impact that you want on the adversary? So that's, to me, that's where the true public-private partnership is coming in. Another good example is actually the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative that CISA, the Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is way too many securities in one sentence, it's that organization that they've set up to actually do joint planning, to do real joint planning between the government and the private sector.
And have you seen impact from these partnerships, or is it notional so far with room for improvement?
Well, I think there's still much room for improvement. JCDC is pretty new, but they're actually starting to really they're going through the process of figuring out how do you do real planning between the public and the private sector. And of course, you have to remember that, the public sector's cadence and pace and reasons and motivations are all different than the private sector. So you have to line those things up too and figure out how to make that work together.
And so who is that translation mechanism between the cyclic rate of private entities and the government?
Yeah, I think you have to find people that have worked in both spaces, that understand the language of both and understand the reasons why they both operate the way they do.
That's interesting. And it's always fascinating to realize that with massive bureaucracies, it comes down to a few very motivated people as opposed to bureaucratic rules or structure, right? So maybe help us tie it into what we're seeing in the world today. Increased conflict, war in Ukraine, competition from other parts of the world. And when you say government, how much are you referring to U.S. government versus the world, different world's governments?
Yeah. I mean, I think in general, when I talk about governments, I really mean sort of responsible Western style democratic governments, things, which includes, countries in Asia like Japan and Korea and things like that, but Singapore. So I think but I think when you look at the threat landscape, when you look at what we're doing to connect more and more devices to the internet, right? And they're not just laptops anymore, right? It's your watch, your lights, dams, anything you can think of, we're hooking it up, cars to the internet. And they're all different. And we're adding them at an incredibly fast pace, right? Cyberspace is the only domain that I know of that's growing on a daily basis, right? On a daily basis, there's not more air, but on a daily basis, there's more cyberspace.
So it occurs to me, so certainly the attack surface area is growing at an incredible rate. The potential for damage from attacks is therefore growing. And it's scary stuff, but why does it seem from an outsider that the damage from attacks is not growing at the same rate?
I think
what are we missing?
Yeah, I think, some of it is that the vast majority of actors right now in cyberspace are criminals. And they don't really want to cause damage for causing damage. That, isn't their goal, right? Their goal is to make money. And so I remember reading this very funny transcript of a FBI interview with a cyber criminal at one point that they had managed to arrest. And they were asking him worried about his, this group's plans, what they might have been able to do. And, they were like, did you ever think about turning the power off? And the guy looked at him, the interviewer, and they were like, are you out of your mind? Why would we turn the power? Nobody could pay us if we turned the power off. Right? Like that's, that was not their motivation, right? Now that's different when you're talking about nation states, and it's different when you're talking about groups that are politically motivated, like what the ransomware attacks in like Peru recently showed, right? Those are different groups.
Fill us in a little bit on that.
So you had an example of where you were actually, the group was actually trying to disrupt the entire economy, essentially, of Peru, and hold as much of the government of Peru hostage as they could through ransomware. And it was really essentially a destructive attack, not intended to, in fact, collect a ransom, but really to just, destabilize the country politically.
Fascinating. So maybe we can take a step back, and we've got the context for these public-private partnerships, the arc of evolution of some of those partnerships. How do we tie this into, and how do we think about the importance of, regulation, information sharing on things like digital communications? Clearly we think of technologies to secure email, like Armorblocks offers, but there's also many, many others out there. We'll loop back to if you were advising, or when you do advise big companies on what to purchase, how to think about it. But first, where do digital communications fit into all this?
So if you think about the world in which we inhabit now, where those kinds of digital communications are not just a nice to have, right? They are absolutely critical to doing your everyday business. CTA, the organization I run, none of us are physically co-located. All of us are distributed. And we were that way before COVID.
All right. Yeah.
And so without digital communications, like CTA ceases to operate, right? So in that space, the criticality of ensuring the continuity of those communication links is just, they become absolutely critical and sort of organizationally existential in a way they probably weren't 25, 30 years ago. And so what this means is that when we start thinking about the companies that enable those communications to occur, you start from a policy standpoint, then the government starts saying, all right, is there a different relationship we're supposed to have with those entities?
And this gets into critical infrastructure?
This gets into critical infrastructure, that's right.
Different authorities?
Different authorities, different rules that, you start saying, the government says that maybe there's a public good aspect to having those communications occur.
Right.
And even if it's not totally profitable, we're going to make sure that you actually have communications to all the different parts of the country. Whether or not that makes sense from a business standpoint, right? We're going to try to, and an example of that is the National Broadband Initiative, right? To try to get broadband communication out to every part of the United States, even where it's not sort of economically feasible from just a pure profit motive.
Sure. And one part critical infrastructure, one part economic
Right.
development. And if you do a lot at the intersection of technology and policy, and if you were just to announce one key change in regulation or law that would make a big difference, what would it be?
So I would say that one of the pieces that we still really lack is this idea of a standard of care. So
All right.
How does a company know when it's actually got enough cybersecurity, if you will, right?
Okay.
How does it measure that? How does it know what is the standard for cybersecurity and it's going to be industry specific, right? We're going to expect different kinds of security from a power company than we are from a financial institution, from a healthcare provider, right? But we do expect that our banks, for example, will have a certain amount of security.
There's a requirement. Or security in the cyber context. All right.
Yep. And so what is the equivalent of that across the economy? And we don't know that. And so the result is that companies are often, therefore, very reluctant, for example, to talk about incidents. Because they don't know if they reveal that they've had a security incident, whether or not people are going to be like, oh, that was kind of tough on you. Or, you moron, why didn't you, do X, Y, or Z? Like, nobody knows, where they fall in that spectrum. And so because of that, there's a lack of information sharing that would be easier if we had those standards.
And those standards, in your mind, should be established through regulation or
Not necessarily. They could
free
be
market forces?
They could be established by custom and practice in a given industry. And then discussed, and they can be set in regulation, and some industries will have that. Medical devices, for example, that's probably going to be highly regulated, right? Other spaces will be less, and it'll be more about sort of common law and court decisions and things like that. But we've got to get to that point where we can actually start settling on that, so that companies know what the benchmark is that they're going to be, held to. Some of that will be driven by insurance. Cyber insurance companies are going to be like, you want a policy? You're actually going to have to do some stuff. And you're going to actually have to show us that you've done some stuff.
And so let's loop it back to the public-private partnerships. How do you catalyze these emergent standards of care?
I think that's where the government can play a role in sort of helping to articulate what those could be, what those standards could be, helping to do research and fund basic research. One of the areas that I'm particularly interested in that was a recommendation from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission is the Bureau of Cyber Statistics. So just like we have a Bureau of Labor Statistics, having a Bureau of the government that is focused solely on figuring out what is the rate of cyber incidents across the economy. Like, not to punish anybody, but just like what is that baseline rate? We actually really don't know. You mentioned the ransomware task force.
Sure.
And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating was in a couple of days before we released our report on ransomware last year, there were on the same day, two private sector companies released reports on ransomware. And one said, for the last quarter of 2020, the rate of ransomware attacks went up. And the other report said, for the last quarter of 2020, the rate of ransomware attacks went down. Both of those companies released that report on the same day.
And were they both self-serving, the
Yes.
direction?
Yes.
There you
And
go.
so it's like...
So maybe a third party
Yes.
would be better.
So it's like,
Yeah.
okay, so maybe we actually need something that can, from like a
arbitrate
neutral
these.
government
Sure.
perspective, that can actually help figure out what that actual rate is, so that we have some baseline to measure from, to know if we're actually getting better. I mean, if you actually, this morning in the Cybersecurity 202 put out by the Post, like they had the survey of the experts about whether or not the United States is more vulnerable to cyber attacks or less vulnerable over the last 5 years. I think actually Paul Rosenweig actually had it right. He's like, who the heck knows? Because we can't actually measure that. So.
Fascinating. Okay, that's a great recommendation. And just as a side note, the ransomware task force report that you co-chaired is a fascinating read and a very impressive 80 pages of both information, but then also recommendations
Yep.
about how to address ransomware over the long haul. So highly recommend it to anybody that hasn't seen it already. Let's say you're talking with CISOs and they're contemplating where to spend their next chunk of their budget. We were talking a little bit ahead of time. What is your core recommendation about how to identify and select good security products?
I mean, I think that you really have to think about how those security products are going to integrate with your business. And you really have to be thinking about it from a risk management standpoint, right? Where do I have risk now that I would like to have less of? And then how does that particular vendor, that particular product contribute to reducing that risk? And how do I also integrate that with my current set of technology that I have? And does that new product or service mean that I need to get rid of something that I've already got in my stack? Because one of the things that you very much see when you study the adversaries, they exploit the seams, the overlaps, the gaps
Sure.
in our security products. And so they rely on complexity. And so if you're just adding complexity to your security environment, you're not actually making yourself better off necessarily.
And how about efficacy? How do we, as a potential user, how do you judge that?
I think that's really hard. I think actually we lack a lot of measures of efficacy in the cybersecurity market. Actually telling real companies that provide really good security compared to the snake oil salesman is actually really hard. And it requires a depth of technical knowledge that's really hard, even for a lot of CISOs, to bring to the table. I mean, we were talking about this before we came on stage. There's a famous article that's from 1970. It's an economics article about the market for lemons in used cars. It's Gary Akeroff, and it is still one of the most cited economics papers out there. And there's been some recent research that actually compares the cybersecurity product market to the used car market, and makes the argument that there is a market for lemons in cybersecurity products.
So it's funny you described that. I think we've probably all lived it a little bit. We all think about the holy grail of self-serve adoption and escaping any sort of trial of a product, but I think paying attention to metrics and looking at the actual efficacy is just as important today as it ever has been. Yeah. I know you do a lot of work with governments outside the U.S., and as we go towards close here, do you think there is a big change that's on the horizon with how either governments work together, or is there an opportunity for an organization to be formed that is the aggregation point across governments?
I mean, I think one of the most interesting things that you have actually seen is the number of products that are now coming out under joint seal from not just multiple agencies within the US government, but across the US government and the UK government and the Canadian government, Australia, New Zealand. That would have been unthinkable, almost, or maybe not unthinkable, but almost impossible bureaucratically to have pulled off when I was in the White House, for example. We did it a couple of times, but it was enormously hard.
What was an example when you were doing it?
So, I mean, we actually did manage to produce some joint, we never actually did a completely joint seal with other countries, but we at least timed the release of certain alerts and warnings.
Gotcha. All right.
Right, but now you actually
coordination.
yeah, we had coordination, but now you're actually seeing them agree and have issue one report, right, on certain kinds of threats. And you're starting to see more international collaboration on things like takedowns and stuff like that. I think the really interesting question is, how big can you expand that tent, if you will?
Okay.
It'll be pretty easy to add some additional really sophisticated players. You could add the Netherlands, you could add Estonia, you could add Israel to that set. But how big can you actually go? Because once you get out of a certain level of governments, basically their capability drops off really fast. You'll often find in many countries the number of officials in the government who have a really sophisticated understanding is actually pretty small.
That's fascinating. And hopefully that evolves over time and aggregation points or at least success cases end up attracting more talent. As we close, can you describe CTA and why a security vendor should join the already good number that are participants, and why, if you're looking to purchase from a security vendor, you'd want to make sure that they're part of an organization like CTA?
Yeah. So, I mean, we exist to enable cybersecurity providers to share threat intelligence with each other. And the basic reason that you would want your security vendors to be part of that is no security vendor has all of the information they would ever want in order to inform their products or services. No one has that kind of information. And so the only way to get it is to share it. And the truth is that for any cybersecurity provider, their value add does not come from the raw data. Their value add comes from what they do with the data. And so therefore, if they have more data, if they have more information, their products and services will be better. And so our fundamental philosophy is that by sharing, we actually raise the level of capability across the entire digital ecosystem. And so if you're a consumer of cybersecurity services, you want to be driving your cybersecurity providers to be participating in those kinds of sharing organizations so that we can raise that level of cybersecurity.
Makes a lot of sense. Michael, thank you.
Yes,
Great
thank you very
talking
much.
with you.
Yes, excellent.
Good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Bye.